Mark Callahan stared at the ceiling of his hospital room, the steady beep of monitors providing a rhythmic backdrop to his thoughts. The dull ache in his side served as a constant reminder of the sacrifice he'd made just 3 days ago. He shifted slightly, wincing at the pull of stitches, but a small smile played on his lips. For Sarah, it was worth it. Always worth it. A soft knock at the door drew his attention. "Come in," he called, voice still slightly hoarse from the intubation during surgery. Sarah entered, her steps hesitant, her face a complex mixture of emotions that Mark couldn't quite decipher. She'd been discharged yesterday, her new kidney, his kidney, already functioning well. The sight of her walking, already looking healthier, made his heart swell with love and pride. "Hey, beautiful," he said, reaching out a hand to her. "How are you feeling?" Sarah's fingers intertwined with his, but her grip was loose, almost reluctant. She perched on the edge of his bed, her eyes downcast. I'm okay, Mark. The doctors say everything looks good." Mark squeezed her hand. "That's great news, honey. I told you we'd get through this together, didn't I?" He chuckled softly, trying to lighten the mood. "Although I have to admit, when I said I'd give you my heart, I didn't think we'd settle on a kidney instead." His attempt at humor fell flat. Sarah didn't laugh, didn't even smile. Instead, she pulled her hand away, wrapping her arms around herself, as if she were cold. "Sarah?" Mark's voice was tinged with concern now. "What's wrong? Are you in pain? Should I call the nurse?" She shook her head, still not meeting his eyes. "No, it's not that. I I need to tell you something, Mark. Something important." The seriousness in her tone made Mark's stomach clench with sudden anxiety. He'd known Sarah for 15 years, been married to her for 10. He could read her like a book, and right now every line of her body screamed tension and guilt. "Okay," he said slowly, pushing himself up to a more upright position, despite the protest from his healing incision. "I'm listening, Sarah. Whatever it is, we'll face it together, just like we always have." Sarah finally looked up at him, her green eyes swimming with unshed tears. The pain and conflict he saw there made his breath catch in his throat. "Mark, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Uh, I've done something terrible, something unforgivable." Mark's heart raced, the beeping of his heart monitor speeding up in tandem. 1,000 possibilities raced through his mind, each worse than the last. "Sarah, please, just tell me what's going on." She took a deep, shuddering breath. I've been unfaithful, Mark. I've been having an affair." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Mark felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. He stared at Sarah, waiting for the punchline, for her to say it was all a bad joke. But the anguish on her face told him this was all too real. "An affair?" he repeated, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "What do you mean, an affair? With who? When?" Sarah's tears spilled over, tracking down her pale cheeks. "It's been going on for about 6 months. His name is David. He's he's a colleague from work." Mark's mind reeled, trying to process this information. 6 months. Half a year of lies, of betrayal. And all this time, he'd been preparing to give her his kidney, to literally give a part of himself to save her life. 6 months, he said, his voice hollow. "You've been cheating on me for 6 months, and you wait until now to tell me. After I've given you my kidney?" The heart monitor's beeping had become frantic now, matching the turmoil in Mark's chest. A nurse poked her head in, drawn by the commotion, but Mark waved her away. Sarah reached for his hand again, but he jerked it back. "Mark, please. I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I was going to end it, I swear. But then I got sick, and you were so wonderful, so supportive. I couldn't bear to hurt you." A bitter laugh escaped Mark's lips. "Couldn't bear to hurt me? So instead, you let me go through major surgery for you while you were sleeping with another man?" The reality of the situation was starting to sink in, bringing with it a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with his recent operation. "How could you, Sarah? How could you do this to us, to our marriage?" The questions tumbled out, each one laced with pain and betrayal. Sarah's sobs grew louder. "I don't know, Mark. I don't know how I let things get so out of control. I love you. I do. David was... he was a mistake. A terrible, horrible mistake." Mark closed his eyes, trying to shut out the sight of his wife's tears, trying to make sense of this nightmare he'd suddenly found himself in. When he opened them again, his gaze was hard, His jaw set. "Get out," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Mark, please." "I said get out." The words exploded from him, causing Sarah to flinch. I can't, I can't look at you right now. I can't even think straight. Just go." Sarah stood on shaky legs, her face a mask of misery. "I'm so sorry, Mark. I never wanted to hurt you. I'll go stay with my sister. When you're ready to talk, don't," Mark cut her off. "Don't tell me where you're going. Don't tell me anything. Just leave." With one last anguished look at her husband, Sarah turned and fled the room, her sobs echoing down the hospital corridor. As the door closed behind her, Mark slumped back against his pillows, feeling as if his world had just shattered into a million pieces. The steady beep of the heart monitor seemed to mock him now, a reminder of the organ he'd given so freely to a woman who had betrayed him so completely. He stared at the ceiling once more, but this time there was no smile on his face. Instead, a single tear slid down his cheek as he wondered how he could possibly move forward from this moment, how he could ever trust again when the person he trusted most had broken his heart while accepting his kidney. The magnitude of Sarah's betrayal washed over him in waves, each one threatening to pull him under. As the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his hospital room, Mark Callahan closed his eyes, wishing he could wake up and find that this had all been nothing more than a terrible dream. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah's confession, and Mark found himself standing in the kitchen of their suburban home, staring at his reflection in the microwave door. The face looking back at him seemed older, more haggard than he remembered. Dark circles underlined his eyes, testament to nights spent tossing and turning, replaying Sarah's words over and over in his mind. He absently rubbed the scar on his side, a physical reminder of his sacrifice. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd given a part of himself to save Sarah, only to have her rip his heart out in return. The house felt cavernous and empty without her presence. Sarah had been staying with her sister since that day in the hospital, respecting Mark's need for space. Their only communication had been through terse text messages about practical matters, bills, mail, her collecting some clothes. The shrill ring of the telephone cut through the silence, making Mark jump. He let it go to voicemail, not in the mood to talk to anyone. After a few rings, the answering machine picked up. "Mark, it's Mom. I haven't heard from you in days, sweetie. Is everything okay? Sarah's not answering her phone either. Give me a call when you can. Love you." Mark sighed, guilt gnawing at him. He hadn't told anyone about Sarah's infidelity yet, not even his parents. Part of him was still processing it himself, while another part clung to the irrational hope that if he didn't say it out loud, it somehow wouldn't be real. He shuffled to the living room, wincing slightly as he lowered himself onto the couch. His eyes fell on the framed photos on the mantel, snapshots of happier times. There was their wedding day, both of them beaming at the camera. A candid shot from their 5th anniversary trip to Hawaii. The two of them, arms around each other at his brother's graduation last year. Had she been cheating even then? The thought made his stomach churn. A knock at the door startled him from his reverie. For a moment his heart leaped, thinking it might be Sarah. But no, she had a key. She wouldn't knock. Reluctantly, he made his way to the door and opened it to find his best friend, Jake, standing there with a six-pack of beer and a concerned expression. "Hey, buddy," Jake said, his tone cautious. "I thought you might need some company." Mark stepped aside to let him in, grateful and annoyed in equal measure. "How did you know?" Jake set the beer on the coffee table and turned to face his friend. "Sarah called me. She's worried about you, man. Said you weren't returning her calls or messages." A bitter laugh escaped Mark's lips. "She's worried about me? That's rich." Jake's brow furrowed. "What's going on, Mark? Sarah mentioned you two had a fight, but she wouldn't give me details. I've never known you guys to go this long without patching things up." Mark sank back onto the couch, suddenly feeling very tired. "It's not a fight, Jake. It's—" He trailed off, the words sticking in his throat. Jake sat down next to him, his concern deepening. "Come on, man. Talk to me. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." Mark took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Sarah cheated on me," he said finally, the words hanging heavy in the air between them. Jake's eyes widened in shock. "What? Are you serious?" Mark nodded, the pain of saying it out loud etched across his face. "She told me in the hospital, right after the transplant surgery. She's been having an affair for 6 months." "Jesus, Mark," Jake breathed, running a hand through his hair. I don't even know what to say. That's that's fucked up. Yeah, Mark agreed, reaching for a beer. He twisted off the cap and took a long swig. Tell me about it. Jake was quiet for a moment, processing the information. So, what happens now? Have you two talked about, where you go from here? Mark shook his head. I haven't been ready to face her. To be honest, I don't know if I'll ever be ready. How do you come back from something like this? I don't know, man, Jake admitted. But you can't avoid it forever. You've got to make a decision at some point. Try to work it out, or end it. The word end sent a jolt through Mark. Despite everything, the thought of his marriage truly being over was almost unbearable. He and Sarah had built a life together, had dreams of starting a family. Could he really walk away from all of that? But then again, how could he stay? How could he ever trust her again? I just keep thinking about the surgery, Mark said quietly. I was so focused on saving her life that I never imagined she'd. He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Jake put a comforting hand on his shoulder. Listen, what you did, donating your kidney, that was an incredible act of love. Sarah's actions don't diminish that. You're a good man, Mark. Remember that. Mark nodded, grateful for his friend's support. Thanks, Jake. I don't know how to move forward. Every time I close my eyes, I see her face when she told me. I hear her voice saying she's been with someone else. How do I get past that? I wish I had an answer for you, Jake said. But whatever you decide, I've got your back. You don't have to go through this alone. As the afternoon wore on, Mark found himself opening up more, sharing details of Sarah's confession, venting his anger and hurt. Jake listened patiently, offering support, and when needed, another beer. By the time Jake left, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the living room. Mark stood in the doorway, watching his friend drive away, feeling slightly less alone than he had that morning. Closing the door, he leaned against it, his mind racing. Jake was right. He couldn't avoid this forever. He needed to talk to Sarah, to decide what came next. The thought filled him with dread, but also a glimmer of something else. Resolution, perhaps, or the first tentative step towards healing. With a deep breath, Mark pulled out his phone and typed out a message to Sarah. We need to talk. Come by the house tomorrow at 2 p.m. His finger hovered over the send button for a long moment before he finally pressed it. As the message whooshed away, Mark felt a mix of anxiety and relief wash over him. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and painful decisions, but at least it would be a step forward, out of this limbo of hurt and uncertainty. As he made his way upstairs to bed, Mark paused by the wedding photo on the mantel. He stared at their smiling faces, remembering the hope and love they'd felt that day. Whatever happened tomorrow, he knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The next day, at precisely 2 p.m., the doorbell rang. Mark, who had been pacing the living room for the past hour, froze in place. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, before walking to the door and opening it. Sarah stood on the porch, looking small and uncertain. Her usual confident posture was gone, replaced by hunched shoulders and nervous fidgeting. Hi, Mark, she said softly. Come in, he replied, his voice carefully neutral. He stepped aside to let her enter, catching a whiff of her familiar perfume as she passed. The scent, once comforting, now made his stomach churn. They settled in the living room, Sarah perching on the edge of the armchair, while Mark sat on the couch, maintaining a physical distance that mirrored the emotional chasm between them. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them until Mark finally broke it. So, he began, his voice rough with emotion, I think it's time we talked about everything. Sarah nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Mark, I don't even know where to begin. I'm so sorry. What I did, it's unforgivable. You're right, it is, Mark said, a hint of bitterness creeping into his tone. But I need to understand, Sarah, why? Why did you do it? Was I not enough? Did our marriage mean so little to you? Sarah flinched at his words. No, Mark. It wasn't like that at all. Our marriage means everything to me. You mean everything to me. Then why? Mark pressed, leaning forward. Help me understand, because right now I'm lost. Sarah took a shaky breath. It it started innocently enough. David and I were working late on a project. We got to talking and I don't know, he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in a long time. Mark felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. And I didn't make you feel seen? It's not that simple, Sarah said, wiping away a tear. We've been together so long, Mark. We fell into routines. Work was stressful. We were both so busy. I felt like we were drifting apart. So instead of talking to me about it, you decided to sleep with someone else. Mark's voice rose, anger bubbling to the surface. I know it was wrong, Sarah said, her voice breaking. I know I should have talked to you, but by the time I realized how far things had gone, I felt trapped. And then I got sick. And you were so wonderful, so supportive. I convinced myself that ending things with David and focusing on us was enough. Mark stood up abruptly, needing to move. He paced the room, running his hands through his hair in frustration. But it wasn't enough, was it? You still kept it a secret. You let me go through with the transplant without telling me the truth. Sarah's sobs grew louder. I was scared, Mark. Scared of losing you, scared of hurting you. I thought if I could just put it behind me, we could move forward. Mark turned to face her, his expression a mix of pain and disbelief. Move forward? Sarah, you broke our vows. You betrayed my trust in the most fundamental way possible. How are we supposed to move forward from that? I don't know, Sarah admitted, her voice small. But I want to try, Mark. I love you. What I did was terrible, but my love for you was never a lie. Mark sank back onto the couch, suddenly feeling very tired. I don't know if love is enough anymore, Sarah. How can I ever trust you again? A heavy silence fell over the room as they both grappled with the weight of that question. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll do whatever it takes, Mark. Therapy, counseling, complete transparency, anything. I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I'm asking for one anyway. Mark closed his eyes, feeling torn. Part of him wanted to forgive her, to try and salvage the life they'd built together. But another part, the part still raw with hurt and betrayal, recoiled at the idea. I don't know if I can do that, Sarah, he said finally. I don't know if I'm strong enough to rebuild from this. Sarah nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I understand, but please, Mark, don't make a decision right now. Take some time. Think about it. I'll respect whatever you decide, but please just think about it. Mark looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she'd arrived. He saw the pain in her eyes, the remorse etched into every line of her face. And despite everything, he felt a twinge of the love that had sustained their relationship for so many years. Okay, he said softly. I'll think about it, but I can't make any promises, Sarah. I don't know if this is something I can get past. Sarah nodded, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. That's all I can ask for. Thank you, Mark. As Sarah gathered her things to leave, Mark felt a sudden urge to ask one last question. Sarah, he called out as she reached the door. She turned, her hand on the doorknob. If you hadn't gotten sick, if I hadn't donated my kidney, would you have ever told me the truth? Sarah's face crumpled, a fresh wave of guilt washing over her. I I don't know, Mark. I'd like to think I would have found the courage eventually, but I honestly don't know. Her honesty, painful as it was somehow comforting. At least now, Mark thought, they were dealing in truths, no matter how difficult they might be. As the door closed behind Sarah, Mark sank onto the stairs, his head in his hands. The conversation had left him emotionally drained, but also with a lot to think about. Could he forgive Sarah? Could they rebuild their marriage from the ashes of her betrayal? Or was it time to accept that some things, once broken, can never truly be repaired? These questions swirled in his mind as the afternoon light faded into evening. Mark knew that the decisions he made in the coming days would shape the rest of his life. As he finally stood and made his way to the kitchen, he realized that, for the first time since Sarah's confession, he felt something other than pain and anger. He felt the stirring of hope, fragile and uncertain, but hope nonetheless. Whether it was hope for reconciliation or hope for a new beginning on his own, he wasn't sure yet. But it was a start. And for now, that would have to be enough. A month had passed since Mark's confrontation with Sarah. The initial shock of her confession had faded, replaced by a dull ache that seemed to permeate every aspect of his life. He'd returned to work, going through the motions of normalcy, while internally grappling with the decision that loomed before him. Today he found himself sitting in the waiting room of Dr. Eleanor Patel, a therapist recommended by his friend Jake. The idea of therapy had initially made Mark uncomfortable, but he'd realized he needed an objective perspective to help him navigate his tumultuous emotions. Mr. Callahan? a warm voice called out. Mark looked up to see a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "I'm Dr. Patel. Please, come in." As Mark settled into a comfortable armchair in Dr. Patel's office, he felt a mix of nervousness and relief. Finally, he could unburden himself to someone who might help him make sense of it all. "So, Mark," Dr. Patel began, her voice calm and reassuring, "why don't you tell me what brings you here today?" Mark took a deep breath. "My wife cheated on me," he said, the words still painful to voice. "I found out right after I donated a kidney to her." Dr. Patel's expression remained neutral, but her eyes reflected empathy. "That must have been incredibly difficult for you. How have you been coping?" "Not well," Mark admitted. "I feel lost, angry, betrayed, but also confused. Part of me wants to try and save our marriage, but another part can't imagine ever trusting her again." Over the next hour, Mark poured out his story. The years of what he thought was a happy marriage, the kidney donation, Sarah's confession, and the turmoil of the past month. Dr. Patel listened attentively, occasionally asking questions to probe deeper into Mark's feelings. As their session neared its end, Dr. Patel leaned forward slightly. "Mark, what you're feeling is entirely normal given the circumstances. Infidelity is a profound betrayal, and it's complicated further by your act of physical sacrifice for Sarah. It's okay to feel conflicted." Mark nodded, grateful for the validation. "But how do I move forward? How do I decide whether to try and forgive her or to end our marriage?" "That's not a decision I can make for you," Dr. Patel said gently. "But I can help you work through your feelings and clarify your thoughts. It might be helpful to consider what you want your life to look like in the future, with or without Sarah." As Mark left the therapist's office, he felt a small weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't magically healed, but he felt more grounded, more capable of facing the decision ahead. Walking through the park near his house, Mark's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Thinking of you. I hope you're doing okay. I miss you." Mark stared at the message, a whirlwind of emotion stirring within him. He missed her too, despite everything. He missed the comfort of their shared life, the inside jokes, the quiet moments of understanding that come from years together. But could those things ever be the same again? As he pondered his response, Mark's attention was caught by an elderly couple on a nearby bench. They sat close together, the woman's head resting on the man's shoulder, their wrinkled hands intertwined. The sight stirred something in Mark, a longing for that kind of enduring love, a reminder of what he and Sarah had once dreamed of building together. With a deep breath, Mark typed out a reply. "I'm doing okay. Just got out of my first therapy session. It helped. Maybe we could talk this weekend?" He hit send before he could second guess himself. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step towards something. Whether that something was reconciliation or closure remained to be seen. As Mark continued his walk, his mind drifted to the future Dr. Patel had asked him to envision. He tried to picture his life without Sarah, the loneliness, the starting over, but also the possibility of finding someone who wouldn't betray his trust. Then he imagined a future where they worked through this, where they rebuilt their relationship stronger than before. Both paths seemed daunting, filled with potential pain and uncertainty. By the time Mark reached home, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. He paused on the front porch, looking at the house he and Sarah had made a home. So many memories lived within those walls, both joyful and now painful. His phone buzzed again. Sarah had replied, "I'd like that. Saturday afternoon, we could meet at the coffee shop on Main Street if you're not comfortable having me at the house." Mark appreciated her consideration. "Saturday at 2 p.m. works. See you then." As he entered the house, Mark felt a subtle shift within himself. He wasn't ready to forgive, wasn't sure if he ever would be. But he was ready to talk, ready to face this crossroads head on. Whatever decision he made, he was determined to make it with clear eyes and an open heart. That night, as Mark lay in bed, he realized that while the pain of Sarah's betrayal still lingered, it no longer consumed him entirely. There was room now for other emotions: hope, determination, even a cautious optimism about the future, whatever it might hold. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in weeks, Mark felt equipped to face them. As he drifted off to sleep, he held on to that feeling, knowing that regardless of the outcome with Sarah, he was on the path to healing. Saturday arrived sooner than Mark expected. As he pushed open the door to the Main Street coffee shop, The familiar aroma of freshly ground beans enveloped him. His eyes scanned the room, quickly finding Sarah seated at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. She looked up as he approached, a tentative smile on her face. "Hi, Mark," she said softly. "Hey," he replied, sliding into the seat across from her. An awkward silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words and lingering hurt. The barista approached, and Mark ordered a black coffee, grateful for the momentary distraction. When they were alone again, Sarah spoke. "How have you been?" she asked, her voice laced with concern and a hint of hope. Mark took a deep breath. "It's been difficult," he admitted. "But I've been seeing a therapist. It's helping me process everything." Sarah nodded, relief visible on her face. "I'm glad to hear that. I've been in therapy too, trying to understand why I did what I did, how to be better." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mark's coffee. He wrapped his hands around the warm mug, mirroring Sarah's posture. "Mark," Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly, "I know I have no right to ask this, but have you thought about us? About whether there's any chance for our marriage?" Mark looked into her eyes, seeing the mixture of fear and hope there. "I've thought about little else," he said quietly. "Sarah, what you did, it shook the very foundation of our relationship. I've been trying to figure out if that foundation can ever be solid again, Stizian." Sarah nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I understand. And I know that whatever you decide, I have to accept it. But Mark, I want you to know that I am committed to rebuilding your trust, if you'll give me the chance. I've ended all contact with David. I've been completely transparent about everything. I know it doesn't erase what I did, but I'm trying to show you that you're the one I want, the one I've always wanted." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. "I believe that you're sorry, Sarah, and I believe that you want to make things right, but I'm not sure if that's enough." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about why I donated my kidney to you. It wasn't just because I loved you, though of course I did. It was because I believed in us, in our future together. I thought we were partners, facing everything life threw at us as a team." Sarah wiped away a tear. We are. Mark, I know I broke that trust, but I want to be that team again." Mark nodded slowly. "I want that too, Sarah. But wanting it doesn't make it possible. I need to know that if we try to rebuild, it won't be in vain, that you're truly committed to our marriage." "I am," Sarah said earnestly. "More than ever. This experience, it's made me realize what I almost threw away. I'll do whatever it takes, Mark. Counseling, complete transparency, anything." Mark took a sip of his coffee, using the moment to collect his thoughts. I think I'm willing to try," he said finally. "But Sarah, you need to understand. This isn't forgiveness. Not yet. It's a chance. A chance to see if we can rebuild what we had, maybe even make it stronger." Sarah's face lit up with hope, but Mark held up a hand. "It won't be easy," he continued. "There will be days when the pain and anger come rushing back. Days when I'm not sure if I can do this. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah reached across the table, hesitating before gently placing her hand on his. "I am," she said firmly. "I know I have a long road ahead to regain your trust, but Mark, I love you. I'm in this for the long haul, no matter how difficult it gets." Mark didn't pull his hand away, but he didn't grasp hers either. "Okay," he said. "Then let's give it a try. But we do this right. We start with couples counseling, and we take it slow." Sarah nodded eagerly. "Of course. Whatever you need, Mark. I'm so grateful for this chance." As they finished their coffee and prepared to leave, Mark felt a mix of emotions swirling within him. There was anxiety about the path ahead, lingering hurt from Sarah's betrayal, but also a small spark of hope. He wasn't naive enough to think things would magically return to normal, but he was willing to see if they could forge a new normal together. Outside the coffee shop, they stood facing each other, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. "So," Sarah said, "what now?" Mark gave her a small, cautious smile. "Now, we take it one day at a time. I'll look into couples counselors and set up an appointment. And maybe we could have dinner next week? Start rebuilding slowly?" Sarah's eyes shone with tears, but this time they were tears of relief and gratitude. "I'd like that very much," she said. As they parted ways, Mark felt as if he was standing at a crossroads. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with potential pitfalls and challenges. but it was also filled with the possibility of redemption, of a love rekindled and strengthened through adversity. Walking home, Mark realized that while the pain of Sarah's betrayal would always be a part of their story, it didn't have to be the end of it. They had a chance to write a new chapter together, one of healing, growth, and renewed commitment. For the first time in months, Mark felt a genuine sense of hope for the future. It wouldn't be easy, and success wasn't guaranteed, but he was ready to try. As he reached his front door, he paused, looking back in the direction Sarah had gone. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped inside, ready to face whatever came next.